big as a small plane.
30 feet?
Hard to tell. Like, it was fairly close. So at night, it's hard to tell.
Any sound?
No sound, nothing. And it was so low, there was a set of school buses outside this town. And I remember I was getting out of the car. The car was still moving because I wanted to get through the ditch and across this parking lot because it was so low, it was going to go in behind these school buses. And then I just watched it and it just sort of pulsed away.
Did it illuminate everything it came close to?
In fact, I had one a year later. I had one, it was a smaller object where I was 50 feet away. This is the one I famously was going to jump on this thing. It was like, you know, the doubting Thomas. Unless I want to touch it. I realized that you could get burned, something could happen, but I had to touch it. And I remember it was this far. It was sitting on a wooden bridge, a drainage bridge, where they were draining water off the fields. And I remember it was sitting this far from the edge of the bridge, and it was so bright you couldn't look at it with binoculars. If you had binoculars,
it hurt your eyes.
It would hurt your eyes. It was so bright, and yet it was this far away from the edge of the bridge, and it just was casting this orange glow. It was an orange object. It was an orange glow on the bridge, and I was thinking about, and to this day, it still haunts me. It's like, why was it not lighting up the bridge? It should have lit up everything.
It should have.
And so we called them dead lights. It was like a very intense light, but not casting any light.
Almost like an LED light does.
Yeah, yeah. And so to me, it sort of dragged me in, and it got me into the situation where I started this chain of command up through trying to find out, and then I chased, you know, the head scientist for the CIA, what the CIA is doing, and I actually came to a conclusion with my latest book that the government actually is leaking material. What they're doing
on purpose.
On purpose, and they've been doing it for 70 years, but what they're doing is they're leaking the course, what's called the core story. They've been here. There's been a crash. We've done some back engineering. We're not doing so well. This core story, but they're protecting the classified information. And so what I do in Managing Magic, the book, is I go through 70 years, because what happened was, if you remember the WikiLeaks emails, one of the big disclosures there was Tom DeLonge, the famous rock star.
Right.
All his emails ended up in there. He had the two generals and the head of Lockheed Skunk Works, and he's dealing with John Podesta. And I suddenly, I saw this, and I realized they're doing it again.
Yeah.
Because I've been in this for a long time. So I was around with Bill Moore in the 1980s when he wrote the first Roswell book. So I knew they'd been doing this all along. And I dealt with Bob Emenegger, who had done this film in the 1970s for the Nixon administration.
Were they being used, these people, and they didn't know it?
Yeah. Well, some of them knew it. Some of them didn't know it. It's sort of like they were offered material, like Disney, for example. Disney did a lot of documentaries for the U.S. government during World War II for the military and stuff like that. And he was asked to do a documentary for the government in 1956. And it was the same thing as Bob Emenegger's in the 1970s, where they offered him a bunch of film and stuff like that. He puts a documentary together, and then they pull the film at the very end. And Bob Emenegger is the most prime example of the fact.
Sure.
I say there's three different options. The government is disclosing, and they're not disclosing, because if they wanted to disclose, they would get the New York Times, the Washington Post, CNN, and Fox.
And pelt them.
And they would take them and show them the crafts, the bodies, give them a letter from the president, have a news conference. So they're not disclosing.
Go on my radio show. All
yeah,
that.
exactly. And they're not covering up. Because if they were covering up, they do. I live in Canada, and because I do the presidents, everybody always says to me, "Well, what's going on in Canada?" Last year, Paul Hellyer told a story about the head of emergency management in Canada.
Former Canadian defense
minister. And he tells a story about this dying guy who was the emergency management guy in Canada, who on his deathbed tells Hellyer, yes, I was briefed. I was taken to Area 51. I went inside a craft, all this kind of stuff. Other than that, people would ask me what's going on in Canada. I'd say, I have no idea.
I don't know.
I have no idea. Because if you want to cover up, you just shut up. Stop talking about it. And you don't say anything. And that's what happens in Australia and Canada and Belgium, and nobody knows what's going on. In the United States of America, everybody's leaking documents, there's people leaking stuff, so they're not covering up. If they wanted to cover up, they would just shut up and the story would go away. And the prime example of that is in the 1970s, is Bob Emenegger. So they shut down Blue Book in 1969, and they never have to ever talk about UFOs again. They don't have to put any press people to answer every UFO sighting that comes up. They can just shut up and do nothing. So what did they do? In 1973, Bob Emenegger, who worked for the Nixon administration for campaign, he was working on their advertising.
He's part of their media guy.
Yeah, and he was working with Gray Advertising in Los Angeles. Yeah. And he was friends with Bob Haldeman. He'd gone to school with Bob Haldeman, the chief of staff for Nixon. And he comes up, and he doesn't believe in UFOs. And he gets called to Norton Air Force Base. And this, to me, is the example. Like, if you want to say that they're covering up, you've got to explain this one. that he gets called there, and they say, well, it's the Watergate days. We got problems with the military, and we need you to do some documentaries to make the U.S. military look better. So they have 8 documentaries. They do 3D holography, working with dolphins, all these kind of things. So fine.
Sounds like the Department of Propaganda.
Yeah, exactly. And he was going to do these films for them. And then they said, and we'd also like you to do a documentary on UFOs. And we'd like you to hide it under the other 8 documentaries. And Bob went, what? You mean this is for real? Because he used to bug his wife. He'd say, Margaret, quit reading that garbage. You know, the alien had my baby stuff. That's garbage. Right. And he suddenly, this is for real? And then he told Paul Shartle, who was the security manager, he said, this is for real? And Paul says, what would you say if I told you that we had a landing of an alien craft at Holloman Air Force Base in May of 1971, and we filmed it from 3 different vantage points.
And they have it.
And they have it. And Linda Howe was offered it, and Bob Emenegger was offered it. And so he had this documentary where he was able to go in anywhere. He said he could go into the Pentagon. He and Alan Sandler, who was his partner, they could walk into the Pentagon without signing in. They were dealing with all the top people. They were dealing with Art Lundahl, who was the top CIA guy that was dealing with UFOs. They did all this stuff. They put out the documentary, and then the funding was coming from the MacArthur Foundation, and they said, oh, Mr. MacArthur's having problems with people bugging him about putting up the money for the film. Could you please pull his name from the credits, but you can keep the money. Right. And so they put this documentary out, and then in the 1980s, Bob tells us, so 69 they shut it down. In 1973, they're pouring gas back on it again and starting it all up again, and allowing these guys to do a documentary that basically says, yeah, this is for real, and we landed an alien at Holloman Air Force Base, but they pulled a film at the very end. And in the documentary, which was called UFOs Past, Present, and Future, 1975 it was released. It was re-released in 1979. In that film, there's 8 seconds of the film that they pulled. So I called Bob, I said...
The best part, too, probably.
Well, no, the worst part, just as the object's coming over the hill into Holloman, and it's just a light coming over the hill. So I said, Bob, you told me they pulled a film. He said, yeah, they did. And he told me this story about some guy driving across the country in a Datsun with this film in the back seat. And I said, but there's 8 seconds in the film. You told me they pulled the film. And he said, but that was just background. I said, what do you mean it was background? He said, it didn't show anything. So they allowed him to use the object as it comes over the hill. When it lands, and you can see the actual alien coming out of the craft, and the craft, that's classified.
You don't see that.
You don't see that. Yeah. So they give him that 8 seconds, and they allow him to use it in the documentary. And then in the 1980s, they're not finished yet. In the 1980s, they want Jacques Vallée involved, and they want J. Allen Hynek. So there's a guy by the name of General Glenn E. Miller, who's now at Norton with Paul Shartle. And they bring them in, and now they say, we want you to do another documentary. The government liked your documentary you did in the 1970s. We'd like you to do another one. And now he's suspicious. He says, why, is this Reagan? Yeah. Is this Reagan behind this?
Somebody's
and nobody gave the answer.
We need to give people the information